So yeah, I let the other class know that I'm trying to figure out a system where you all can be working, like logged on. So I know everybody's here. We're focusing on the projects, right? And you could be working independently where you don't hear me talking, so you can focus on your audio that you're working on, right? Still have to figure that out. I believe it's going to be through like breakout rooms. I just don't know the full capacity of that yet. Somebody had mentioned to me something about individually changing like levels of audio from each person's input. But I don't know anything about where they were mentioning that's accessible. So still trying to figure out the specifics on how that'll work, because I want you guys to be able to focus on your projects and not listen to me while you're trying to listen to your project. So more to come hopefully on that next class. And so, yeah, and for those there's a few people that take this class asynchronously. And because I didn't have this recording, again, just going to say that after this, I'll have you guys watch all those video links on the schedule, and then we'll start with the tutorial. Just opening up my notes over here. It's all pretty fresh, but it's always good to have notes. Come on, MacBook. You could do it. Okay. I'm also expecting an important call today. I don't know if they're going to call during class or not, but hopefully not. Okay, so this lecture, we're going to be going over basically like what is sound, right? So you guys have a better understanding moving forward. Some terms relating to your use here in this project, variations of recording methods, our editing that we have, here in this digital platform, as well as the digitization of audio. So kind of moving in, this is reviewing, I guess, what I was already discussing at the beginning of the semester. I believe I say this now in the basic computer first lecture, how sound itself that we hear is analog. It's analog in nature. It occupies physical space. And the technical term they use for that, or the politically correct term, is how audio propagates through space. So you can think of it as waves, right? There's a source of the audio, and then those waves move through space. They propagate through space, and they reach either a microphone or your ear, right? And it needs some kind of physical matter. It doesn't have to be, like air is a gas, right? So it needs some kind of physical substance to move through. And depending on what that substance is, it's going to also alter the waves, right? So that's why if you have somebody behind a wall without any insulation, it sounds very light, versus somebody in a car, right? It's different substances that audio is traveling through. And before the digital era, audio, from what I read recently, audio is referred to as simply analog. I don't know this from personal experience, just kind of like a fun fact that I picked up recently. So the one thing that I'm expecting everyone to know, and a lot of you, I'm sure you're kind of beyond some of the bare bones basic components here, but coming out of this class and taking these 4 different sections, the one major thing you need to comprehend with audio is that we have the ability of differentiating either between mono or stereo. And for those of you who are familiar with it, it's like, really, how is that important? Like, that's the biggest thing. Well, a lot of people, I teach this, I've taught this a lot, and a lot of people seem to not be able to remember like what stereo is, or how it works, right? Like something's not clicking in their head. So I'm going to try to break this down a little bit more than I normally do. And I guess I'll start with mono. Mono itself is just one source. You can think of it as like one speaker, or myself speaking right now. My mouth is one. It's one. It's mono, right? So if I were to record that, which I don't know if I really am. I'm picking it up with my microphone. Oh yeah, I'm recording this video. There you go. This microphone is one microphone, right? It doesn't know the difference between spatial. Like if I move left to right, you can hear me maybe moving further away from the microphone, but you can't tell. If you close your eyes, you wouldn't be able to tell if I'm on the left or right side of you, right? Whereas if you were able to record in stereo and you have headphones on, and if I had 2 microphones here that were spaced apart, granted the whole pipeline from me to you would have to be set up for stereo. But in theory, right, if I have these 2 microphones and I did that same thing, I turn one side and talk, turn the other, you should, in theory, be able to hear that. And the reason being is each one of those microphones is a mono source, a mono track. They're creating a track, right? And each of those mono tracks are laid out on a timeline, and they're just dedicated for one on each ear, right? That's stereo. Most televisions have 2 speakers for stereo, left and right. Your headphones, your car stereo. Pretty much everything these days uses stereo. Phones are now being produced with stereo audio. You turn them sideways, right? Has left and right channels. I don't think that even like the newest iPhone 12, I don't think that any phones come with dual microphones. So the ability to capture in stereo audio, even if they did, it's still like they're so close to one another. How are they really like picking up anything spatially, right? The whole point of having multiple microphones to have that kind of effect, right? Because you're trying to just basically replicate what your ears are doing. Your one ear is listening to things like coming from the right side, your left is coming from the left side, right? So if you want to capture somewhat accurate spatial audio with stereo, you generally need a recorder with 2 microphones that has them facing each of those directions. So kind of continuing on from this, panning is literally that term based on like starting with a higher volume on one channel, and over time, like as you play a file, you can shift the volume down on that original and you shift it up on the other. So it gives you that effect that something's moving through space, right? It's like kind of going from one side of you to the other through audio, through your ears. Layering is literally just taking different audio sources, putting them on the same timeline, similarly to how we can have, in Photoshop, we have multiple images stacked on top of one another, right? We should all get a sense of like how audio is being layered, and we're going to be seeing that today as well. And then we have these different tonal qualities. I'm not going to cover a lot of these in depth. All of this and more is on your vocab sheet. So you'll definitely want to check out the vocab sheet. One thing I didn't mention that I told the other class is quiz for that is next Monday. So in 1 week. And now that I think about it, I won't mention anything right there. Your project proposal is due tomorrow for this new project. So I do acknowledge that you guys are probably trying to finish this other project, but in order to make sure we have enough time for audio so that we also have enough time to get through coding, you definitely will have to stop and spend 10, 15 minutes coming up with your proposal and typing it out. When writing that, it's definitely helpful to have already looked over the vocab sheet, because there is a lot of different terms on there that will make you think in a different way. Either refamiliarize yourself with things that you already know or introduce you to some topics. And really your project is going to end up being more conceptual of a structure than anything. And that's what I want your proposals really to be focusing on, is like, what is that structure? I don't need you to tell me how it's specifically going to sound over time, and like, you don't need to like give me a full detail of like the whole description of your track or your tracks. It just simply needs to be, what's your theme? How are you structuring it? Are you, there's a whole project description on it, but I just wanted to bring up the fact that the vocab terms will definitely help out in coming forward with that. The big one we're going to cover today is amplitude, which is essentially volume. So how low and how high something can get. And the other thing I want to mention is rhythm and tempo. And I don't really ever talk about these, and in hindsight, I really don't see much utilization within this particular area in projects. And I'm thinking, well, maybe I got to cover it in class, right? So I looked up online, so I have a deeper understanding of the two, because my background's not in audio. I cover this kind of content for teaching purposes, and then get you guys familiarized with like what you can do with the system. But in terms of the technicalities, I don't work with this all the time. So for me, I don't remember this. So I get these two terms confused a little bit, like rhythm and tempo. Are they the same thing? How are they differentiated, right? So I looked them up, and rhythm can be associated to where you're placing individual sounds in time, right? Where, like a metronome, right? You're placing a tick in a certain period of time. However, a metronome can also be associated to tempo, in that a metronome keeps the tempo. A tempo is like a pace. And you could also think of tempo as like beats per minute in audio. How frequently is something like the flow? How is that flow going over time. And the tempo can increase or decrease. So you use rhythm to generate a tempo, right? And I think that's important to kind of keep in mind in terms of like creating audio, is that you have the ability at altering that, right? You can structure those properties. Even if it's just like a background component, right? You can have something kind of evolving on its own accord in the background. So normally I ask here, what are the two different pieces? Like, what is digital audio? There are two defining categories. Like, how is digital audio formatted? What is it? How can it be related? And most people get the one, and usually this is kind of referred to in several different ways, but you could break it all down into the term of being sampled. It's sampled audio. It's anything that's been, anything in the real world, physical, right? It's had to have happened in the real world and somehow picked up or captured by a microphone, a recorder, some kind of recording device. So in some fashion, it has to be a microphone. It doesn't have to be a traditional microphone, some kind of pickup device, right? And then that gets converted into digits. The other alternative is MIDI. It is a computerized coding language that was developed, and it's essentially generating audio without using analog sources. Now, sure, you could use a sampled audio clip and log that sampled audio clip to a keyboard and then generate a song based on that with MIDI. You could do that. However, MIDI is realistically like structured with computerized tones and computerized kind of I don't want to say symphony, but like you're creating a track with MIDI, right? Over time, you can have stuff thrown together. Anywho, there is a whole video describing MIDI, so I'm not going to go into depth on it. And the video is pretty fun, I believe, as well. So I keep showing it. Okay, so I'm not going to be talking a lot about frequency. There's a whole video on this as well. However, I want to briefly talk about it so you have a primer. And now this is the kind of retro view of Audacity. And this is a mono track, and this is a mono track on the timeline. So it's kind of like a wave being shown on the timeline. And the top wave is a different frequency than the bottom wave. And frequency is literally just based on how frequent is a wave moving. And they'll go into detail in explaining this, but essentially how frequent something is, like a sound, can change the pitch and the overall tonal qualities. So you can kind of see here, we zoomed pretty far in, you can see one has a higher frequency than the other. Higher one being the bottom, because it's more frequent. So just trying to get general understandings for you guys right now, and then you're going to pick up the supplemental from these video clips. So these waveforms I was referring to are visual representations of audio, and they could have different shapes, although these classifications of shapes are mainly just like a pictorial description of an auditory component, if that's making sense. So it's kind of more like a vernacular to refer to, right? I guess that's, any way you're referring to audio is based on vernacular, I guess, right? Anytime you describe anything, I guess, if you really want to think about it. But you'll also get a reference in listening to these different types of waves. So you can get a rough understanding of what they can do, right? And how you can integrate them separately. Amplitude, another term that I was mentioning, is how loud something can get. And the one disclaimer here that I gave to my other class is that I just stumbled on this when I was giving the exercise. I don't fully remember the logic between this system and the next I'm going to show you in the exercise. In terms of the numbers, why the numbers are laid out in the way they are. But the more important thing here to look at is if we focus in on the 0 right here as 0 decibels, like 0 volume essentially, we can imagine that as a line going across the center here. How high and how low something is, that is the amplitude, that is the volume. And the way that I like to think about it is, if we have a speaker, right? And if you're looking at my webcam here, a speaker like pushes out in space, right? So as a speaker pushes, that wave is being sent out, right? But a speaker also has to contract back in before it can push again, right? That modulation. And you could think of the push out as going above the wave or above the 0, and the pullback as being below. At least that's how I like to think of it. And you could just see the two different volumes right here. They have the same frequency, right? It's being just as frequent, but one is quieter than the other. It's rounded off. Modulation, I don't think anybody has ever gotten into this working with our classes. And my definition here is really fuzzy. Modulation. So I believe it's really just imposing a filtered structure over some kind of layer, right? Whatever your selection is. And you're going to be, in fact, modifying the characteristics of that in a variety of ways, right? You're taking that original source and you're manipulating it. Maybe I should have like a visual example for that too, but I think I have executed it earlier on a few years ago. It has an interesting effect. There is an option in the program. And one of the things I like you guys to do is, unlike Photoshop where I say, okay, let's go up and use this gain. And okay, now try this. I like to show you guys where the effects are, and then you go out and you experiment with them. Because as I'm talking to you, right, the nature of audio, you can't fully focus and listen in on audio if I'm talking. So I like to show you guys where the tools are. You go through and you play through these different effects, and then you choose whatever effect seems like it would work best for your proposed project. So moving forward, recording. I already talked a little bit about different types of microphone, or no, talk about stereo, right? Using two different microphones. But what are you recording it to? Well, if you have an external recorder, obviously you can put it on that and then transfer it to your computer. You can use a mixer that's directly connected to your computer. So you could be altering that input as it's being sent to the computer, right? Like using an EQ, an equalizer. All this is probably pretty familiar or generally familiar. We already talked about mono and stereo. Oops, let me go back to my. Some things I have as notes. Nope, already talked about the human ears. And this is just a quick visual example of the different ways in which different microphones pick up audio. And by pick up, I mean capture in which direction and like how far of a range. So one that a lot of you would be more familiar with is a shotgun microphone. It looks like it's pointed forward. And that generally is just pickup range is directly whatever you're pointing it at. But if you guys are, interested in the different options available, number one, I could tell you that Media Study has probably the best selection of audio equipment from any place that I've ever been to. And I've went through, I think I've been to like 5 different schools after high school. Tried out of school, didn't work, went to community college, went to study abroad, all these different places focused in around the same kind of media. But DMS is probably the best equipment that I've ran across. And I've even looked at like a few, I don't want to say Ivy League, but like some of the top 5. I went to 2 of the top 5 grad schools for art in the country, and neither of them had as good of an equipment room either. So if you guys are wanting to discover more of like what tools you have access to making things, I definitely would advise, using, getting set up a lab fee next semester and checking stuff out and playing with it. But so this link here will actually give you a huge breakdown of what you can do with different microphones. Dynamic ranges. We're going to talk about dynamic ranges here in a second. So this is just a quick reference. When you guys are cutting waveforms, like when you're cutting an audio clip, where do you cut it? Generally, you don't want to cut it, when there's some kind of action happening. Just like you want to cut film when there's action happening, right? It can create a jarring effect in film. Same thing with audio. It can create a jarring effect. So if I have somebody like yelling, right, you're screaming and you cut it right there, it's going to be kind of weird. Kind of like Ace Ventura when he's opening and closing the door in that movie. I know that's a really obscure reference, but I just thought of it. Generally, you don't zoom in that far to where you can see the individual waveform, but it's just a visual reference. You generally want to pick an area where it's more silent, so it's not as noticeable. However, maybe your project is about being not so subtle, right? So you could be playing around with where to cut things. So dynamic range is specifically talking about the loudest and the quietest capabilities of your audio. And there's many, many factors that can go into dynamic range, which is why we're using about basically like the bare minimum. A lot of recorders, even the DMS, like basic recorders or Tascam, at their defaults, those are going to be capturing at higher quality than what we are going to be using in class. And reason being is all of us are going to be playing this back, not on studio microphone or not on studio like speakers. We're going to be playing it back on like cheap headphones, right? including myself. When I listen to your projects, I'm also going to be using like a studio, you know, cheaper pair of headphones. So there's no point in making a larger file size, which is what you need to have a higher dynamic range. And I'll give you a visual here. When we digitize audio, obviously we have our waveform that's going up and down. And obviously this is just one side of, is this one side? I don't even know. This visual example, I guess, doesn't totally make sense to me. But either way, what's important is these two here. You can see that over time, the rate at which we sample is the sampling rate, right? Like how frequently are we sampling? The more we sample per second, that takes up more data, right? We also have the volume, how high and how low something is. Well, if we keep incrementally saving how high and how low something is, that also increases the memory because we need the computer to be specific. And not only do those things go into factor of how the dynamic range is working, we also have to factor in that every element of this whole entire pipeline, from moment of recording all the way through production, all the way to your equipment that you're using to play it back, every element has to be supportive of a higher bit depth range. So if you really enjoy audio, like the fidelity of audio or the quality of audio, you could be said to be an audiophile, right? Somebody who enjoys like the best audio experience. And to obtain that kind of quality, you have to have all of those levels in place. It doesn't do you any justice to buy or download higher quality audio if your playback device isn't supportive of that audio. So, you know, like on Spotify on your phone, for example, you could choose, you know, high quality playback. Well, why does it matter if you're using cheap earbuds or the speaker, the tiny speaker that comes on your phone, right? So you got to be aware of that too, just similarly to like how much data you're taking up with your image files. Same here as well. We only need to be really utilizing as much data as we need. So the rest of these slides is just kind of visual reference of where these things fall in line. Standard CD is a good one to kind of demonstrate. The sampling rate is about 41.1 K, which is how you'll traditionally see it written out, or 48 K, which is considered professional, blah, blah, blah. But can go beyond that. And generally, you know, it's not really so much more anymore, but back in the day when Blu-rays were a thing, it's like, well, why would you buy a Blu-ray? Because you also have to buy an HD TV. And then if you have an HD TV, well, it probably means you really enjoy, you know, having a better experience. And if you have a better experience, you probably want to you'll probably have like surround sound, in which case you probably want a better audio experience. So as the quality of things progress, everything kind of bolsters with it, not just one component at a time, right? So I think these are a couple other visual examples. We're going to be just dealing with 8 bits, which visually represented on our kind of EQ there, not EQ, our like spectrograph, right? It shows our volume range in real time when we're playing an audio file in our editing program. Is it spectrograph? I don't know, our volume analyzer or whatever that's called. I'm blanking. That our kind of like line where we want to focus in is going to be based on 12, like 12 decibels. And I'll show you once we get in there, but anything beyond 12, we get like warning colors in yellow telling us that we might be losing, we might be getting close to clipping audio. And clipping audio, in a sense, is it's a term that I also put on the vocab this semester. There's a few more terms that I realized are better to know than what were on there before. So clipping is any time where you have audio that's so loud that it exceeds the capabilities of the equipment to pick it up. And then if you have something that's too loud for the microphone to pick up, then anything that goes beyond that threshold is lost, right? The computer doesn't know what it is. You could relate that to, you know, getting a tiny little thumbnail for Photoshop and then expanding it really far. It's all pixelated, right? Similarly with audio, you want to make sure you're capturing the full range of whatever it is you're recording. And when you're outputting that audio, when you're editing or mixing that audio, excuse me, you want to make sure that that range is also not going beyond that threshold so that when people play it back, we're not losing fidelity, right? We're maintaining as much fidelity as we can. So with that being said, if we're focusing in on 12, it's positive 12, negative 12, which is 24. And then we have two channels left and right, which I guess is the theory of which way, you know, how we get to 48 for a dynamic range of an 8-bit file. I haven't looked it up for quite a while. But in generalities here, we're using the 8-bit because we're dealing with low quality equipment and it takes less file size. So again, we're going to be dealing with, you know, a lower sampling rate. And you can see Pro Studio is around this 24-bit mark. And it does go beyond that. But last thing to mention is that Audacity accepts most most file formats to be audio, like mixing audio with. Talking over myself. However, it will not export MP3s unless you download and install a codec. I don't remember if it prompts you to do it or if it just doesn't have the option until you install a codec. Either way, doesn't really matter, I don't think. I think that P5JS will have several audio formats that it supports, so we should be fine. Anyway, just like in, you know, image file formats that we were talking about, uncompressed is going to be giving you like the most raw format possible. So if you're dealing like in the studio, you're exchanging files, you're mixing for like a CD, that sort of thing, you always want to retain the highest quality possible, the uncompressed. However, if you're just using it for stuff like we are, I mean, totally compressed is going to be the way to go. Even recording, right? So that should do it for this.